Here's a photo of the Toronto Maple Leafs in a match against the New York Americans on November 20th, 1930. It was the Leafs' fourth game of their 30-31 season, and you can see Ace Bailey in the background and Busher Jackson in the crease, two of the players who had returned from the previous year's team. Two guys who did not come back were Art Smith and Eric Pettinger because they had been traded to the Ottawa Senators in the offseason. Valued at a combined $15,000, Smith and Pettinger were packaged along with the unheard of sum of $35,000 cash for a single player. After the entire Leafs franchise had been purchased for $200,000, Conn Smythe was now spending $50,000 on one man. This man, King Clancy. Remember him? The guy once described as a combination Wildcat, Human Express, and Goodfellow? He was the player that the Leafs owner, general manager, and coach knew was the missing ingredient for a Stanley Cup team. Clancy was already an established NHL star, having played 9 seasons with the Sens. But in 1930, Ottawa desperately needed cash and were forced to sell their heart and soul player. However, the other Maple Leaf owners weren't really keen on spending that much money for the veteran defenseman. And here's where the story gets good. You see, over the years, Conn had been into horses and horse racing as much as he'd ever been into hockey. For example, in 1926, he took the cash he received after being dumped by the New York Rangers and he betted on a horse race. Won, took that money and betted on a hockey game, won, and then had enough money to convince J.P. Bickle and others to back his purchase of the St. Patrick's. In this case, Smythe spent $250 to buy Rare Jewel, a 2-year-old horse who had never raced in her life. And it showed in the first few outings, which were disasters, but Conn entered her in a big race and bet $100 against odds of 107-1 that his pony would win, which she did. His windfall was almost a third of the cash that the Senators demanded and was enough to persuade Leafs ownership to okay the acquisition of Clancy, who went on to play almost as many games with Toronto as he had in Ottawa. But he wasn't the only new face on the team that year. Toronto was joined by both Alex Levinsky, the first Jewish player in the NHL, and this guy, Bob Gracie. Gracie played for 6 different teams during his 9-year career in the 1930s, back when the league fluctuated between 7 and 10 teams. The 1930-31 season did see the Leafs return to playoff form due to superb goaltending by Lawrence Chabot and solid support from players like Baldy Cotton, who was 5th in team scoring behind Ace Bailey and the Kidline Trio. When the regular season ended, Toronto finished 2nd in their division. Conacher had led the league in goals and Primo in assists, but they couldn't keep the club from losing to Chicago in the quarterfinals. Even though the Maple Leafs were playing well enough to qualify for the postseason, Smythe, who had stepped down as coach for Art Duncan, spoke openly about how making the playoffs even every year wouldn't be enough to save his club financially. Not while it played in that 20-year-old arena on Mutual Street. What the old barn had in history, hockey's first broadcasts were from there, it lacked in size and was the 2nd smallest rink in the NHL. Here's an ad for a March 1931 game against Chicago. While it resembles many previous ads, this one has a new twist. It includes an invitation to buy shares in something called Maple Leaf Gardens. Even today, it is impossible not to be impressed that construction began there at the beginning of June, but Toronto played its first game there November 12th, less than 5.5 months later. Those who thought Conn was foolish for undertaking such a construction project during the cash-strapped depression referred to the entire arena plan as Smythe's folly. Financed by selling shares or exchanging them for labor, the Gardens was simply designed and decorated, offered unobstructed views, and, most importantly, it eventually held twice the number of spectators than the arena on Mutual Street. You know, Conn had built a worthy team and now had built them a worthy home. Opening night was national news and a great public distraction from the crippled economy. Images of the event and of the building itself were used on a range of collectible items and postcards, including this one, where the words Maple Leaf Gardens were added for effect. One of the people there on opening night was Thomas Daly, though everybody called him Tim. And if you don't know his name, you might recognize his face because he spent more than 30 years with the Leafs, mainly as their trainer. Daly had held the same position with the St. Pats when Smythe bought them in 1927, and he was retained alongside Hap Day and Ace Bailey. Amazingly, Daly didn't retire until 1960. He was described as gruff and hard to impress and was involved in 7 Toronto championship teams. When players celebrated noisily after capturing the Stanley Cup in 1949, he said to them, "I don't know why you guys are so excited at winning. We do it every year." Tim Daly is also the man who gave Busher Jackson his nickname. It was actually an insult in response to the young rookie's arrogance about his own talent. Daly called him a busher, meaning Jackson was no more than a Bush League player, and the tag stuck. Here's Daly towards the very end of his career. He's on the far right in the center row, with further Leafs legends like George Armstrong, Johnny Bower, and Tim Horton. You'll find Tim Daly in every team photo in this series, and he knew every Leaf we mention, so it's only fitting that his name is remembered as well. When the 1931-32 NHL season started, there were only 8 teams, with both the Ottawa Senators and the Philadelphia Quakers out. For Toronto, things started off poorly, including their Maple Leaf Gardens opening night loss to Chicago. And after 5 winless games, Smythe dropped Art Duncan and brought in the man who would be the Leafs coach for the next 9 years, Dick Irvin. His first game behind the bench was supposed to be spent simply observing the team while Con coached. With the Leafs losing 5-1 in the second period, Smythe turned to Irvin and said, "You can take over now, Dick," and walked away. No pressure. For the record, Toronto came back and won the game 6-5 in overtime. Irvin's club welcomed additional scoring strength from newcomers Frank Finnegan and Harold Dura, while eventual Lady Byng winner Joe Primo quarterbacked a kid line that averaged 3 points a game in the regular season. And when the playoffs came, that Maple Leafs team would not be denied. After beating the Blackhawks in the first round and the Maroons in the second, Toronto went on to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time and swept the Rangers, the same club Conn Smythe had originally built with Primo. On opening night, Captain Hap Day promised that the team would celebrate the new Maple Leaf Gardens by winning the Stanley Cup, and now they were NHL champs. There's Hap, sitting next to Smythe in the front row, and the Leafs in 1931 in their brand new arena the season they won that first cup. You can see Tim Daly standing to the left. Dick Irvin sits between Smythe and Smythe's right-hand man since 1929, Frank Selke. Conn had achieved his dream of creating a championship team and giving them a home befitting that status. With a Stanley Cup and a sparkling new cathedral to hockey, he was on top of the world. But there was trouble on the horizon, which would come from a distant shore.